So, tell me when you're ready to go, Marisol.
Ready.
Okay. Howdy, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our first lecture of the 2021-2022 Weeding Out Neutrality lecture series. This inaugural lecture is titled, session, I should say, is titled, Can I Get a Library Pass? Recounting the Unseen History of School Libraries and Their Librarians in American Public School Librarianship History. My name is Jeremy Brett, and I am the curator of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Research Collection at Cushing Memorial Library and Archives, and I'm also a member of the library's Diversity Advancement Committee, the body responsible for today's lecture and the three-part series. One of the committee's purposes is to promote diversity awareness and education, addressing equity, diversity, and inclusion topics that affect both employees and the university libraries community at large, through programs, events such as the one you're going to be paying attention to today. Before I turn this back over to our committee head, Marisol Moreno, I just want to say a few things. Before we get started, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement, very briefly. We acknowledge that Texas A&M University, College Station, is situated on the land of multiple Native nations, past and present. These original homelands are the territory of indigenous peoples who are largely dispossessed and removed. We specifically acknowledge the traditional stewardship of this land by the Tonkawa, the Tawakoni, the Hueco, the Sana, the Wichita, and the Coahuiltecan peoples. We pledge to support and advocate for the histories, cultures, languages, and territorial rights of historic indigenous peoples of Texas and the indigenous people that live here now. This statement affirms continuous indigenous presence and rights, acknowledges the ongoing effects of settler colonization, and supports indigenous struggles for political, legal, and cultural sovereignty. And we'll see on the screen that if you're more interested information on indigenous territories across North America, North and Central America, to find out what land you are on, this is a useful tool for finding that particular information out. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping rules, community expectations. Please silence your microphone if you haven't already, mute yourselves. In the chat, please be respectful of each other and of our speaker especially. If you have questions for the speaker, you are free to submit them to me in the chat, and I will pass them along. If you prefer to hold them for the Q&A process at the end of the conversation, that is also fine. Of course, you guys are all adults, you all familiar with how this works, but of course, anyone who for some reason decides not to adhere to these conditions will be removed from the space. The session will take about 40 minutes, which should leave us a good 15 minutes or so for Q&A. Again, if there are any questions for the chat, you can put them, if you have any questions, you can plug them into the chat and I will keep them in reserve and hold them and be sure to read them out during the Q&A session. And with that, I will turn this back over to Marisol, who will introduce our speakers. I'm going to share the screen here. One second. Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Jeremy. Howdy, everyone. My name is Marisol Moreno. As Jeremy said, I'm the Diversity Program Coordinator for the University Libraries. It's our great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Wayne Wiegand. Dr. Wiegand, often referred to as the Dean of American Library Historians, is an F. William Summers Professor of Library and Information Studies Emeritus at Florida State University. He received a BA in History at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh in 1968 and an MA in History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and an MLS at Western Michigan University and a PhD in History at Southern Illinois University in 1974. He has authored more than 100 scholarly articles and authored and/or edited more than 20 books on the subject. Dr. Wiegand also organized the Florida Book Awards, now the nation's most comprehensive state book awards program, and served as its first director from 2006 to 2012. He is now retired from teaching, but continues to embark in projects, one of which is a book to analyze racial integration of public school libraries in the South from 1954 through 1972. Dr. Wiegand, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna go ahead and jump right in. So I've got a couple of questions for you, and we want to make sure that we're respectful of everyone's time and to kind of, get that perspective from you of this book. So my first question is, so your book is considered as the first comprehensive, and by the way, the book is not appearing, but it's this book here. So your book is considered as the first comprehensive evaluative history of the American public school library. Its content includes, to name a few, discussing issues of race, social class, gender, and sexual orientation as they weave their way through the history of American public school librarianship, identifying the public school library's historical jurisdictions and opportunities, challenging the priorities of the profession's current agenda, particularly regarding the role of reading in the everyday lives of children and young adults. These topics seek to address a crucial why question that you present in the introduction of your book. Why did school librarianship turn out the way it did, and what can its history tell us about its limitations and opportunities in the 21st century's coming decades? Can you take us through how you developed this framework?
Sure. First of all, I'm guessing that at least half of your audience, more than half of your audience, had a public school library experience. And I want you to reflect on that as I'm talking about certain things. The framework that I developed really surfaced, let's say, in the 1990s. I had just finished a biography of Melville Dewey, found some very uncomfortable things about his past that heretofore had not been brought to light. And I was reading what at the time were called the crits. The crits populated a variety of disciplines. The one you probably are most familiar with would be the critical race theory that Derek Bell developed at the Harvard Law School, but it was also critical analysis through gendered lenses, through class lenses, through the lens of sexual orientation. And I was reading all this stuff, and I realized that there were things that we did in the practice of librarianship that limited our ability to perceive certain systemic isms, systemic sexism, systemic racism, systemic homophobia. And I thought, if I construct these lenses and take a look at the history of librarianship through each of them, what would they reveal? About the same time, I was reading a number of philosophers. One of them is Michel Foucault. Foucault hypothesized this concept of discourse, which is another way of saying a way of thinking. It suggests that we all play in a sandbox, and we all have lots of opportunities to exercise creativity in that sandbox. But what we don't recognize while we're playing in this sandbox is that the sandbox itself has some limitations. And I found that a persuasive way of looking at library history through all of these separate lenses. Then another philosopher I was reading was Jürgen Habermas, who identified the concept of public sphere. We often call it public square these days. That is, there are a series of places, both physical and mental, in which we reside. And those places have the capacity to influence us in a number of ways. I thought it only natural to think of the library, whether academic, school, public, or special, as a place where certain things can occur or can't occur. So I incorporated place and discourse into my thinking, and I came up with an article that I called Tunnel Vision and Blind Spots. That was published in Library Quarterly in the late 1990s. I gave a talk on it at the Library of Congress, in which I suggest that the boundaries of our sandbox are somewhat limiting to us. I also encouraged people at that time, it's time for us not to look at the user in the life of the library, but look at the library in the life of the user, because that perspective changes a number of things. If you look at the library in the life of the user, the issue of place, for example, could seem fairly important. people use libraries differently. Also, by that time, we had, by looking at the library and the life of the user, certain things emerged. First of all, the library profession's discourse has, since the French Enlightenment, focused on something at that time was called useful knowledge. Very practical stuff that people could put to use in order to improve their lives. At the time, capitalism was also dividing people's lives differently than they had previously. It used to be people's lives ran from sun up to sunrise. But once capitalism introduced industrialism, people's lives were governed by a clock. And so when you weren't on the clock in an industry doing work for someone, that was your leisure time. And over time, we developed a concept that leisure time activities were less valuable than work time activities. So that all ties into that useful knowledge phrase that came to us in the late 17th century, and gradually over time evolved into what we now call information. Now, information is supposedly the primary professional imperative we have in librarianship, providing access to information. But for me, I was also reading in the area of, I was also doing a lot of research in the area of reading. By the 20th century, librarianship had evolved two kinds of reading in its thinking. One was serious reading, the other was leisure reading. Let me focus on serious reading for just a second. In the early 19th century, as more and more women wrote romances that were being reviewed in the male-dominated reviewing media, they came to provide code words to certain kinds of reading. One code word was serious. When they referenced serious reading, they were talking about not the romances that women are writing in great numbers and getting good sales. The other kind of reading was M-E-R-E. I have a feeling they were playing with words because mare also sounds like the female horse. But serious reading as a code word has come down to us to the present day. Anybody pick up the New York Times or read New York Times book review last Sunday, I'm sure saw the words serious reading in a number of places. Serious reading, for some, because of the historical evolution, serious reading is more important than leisure reading, and we've picked that up in librarianship, and that's a bad thing for us to do, because by identifying certain categories of reading as leisure and others as serious, we've evaluated them and we built bibliographic structures that address them in separate ways. So that was the way I went into, that's the theoretical framework from which I came. I worked into the early 21st century, and I applied it at a variety of research projects. So I'm going to do like Marisol did and show up a couple of things. My first project was Main Street Public Library. I wanted to look at the small public library in history, and I looked at it from 1876 through 1957, which was when the federal government passed the Library Services Act, the first federal help. I made a database of the entire contents of five small public libraries. Because these communities were almost entirely white, race was not a lens that I would normally use, but that database showed me that the library very much favored not serious reading, but leisure reading. That's what was being done there. And by reading the local newspapers, I could see that the library as a place, these were all Carnegie libraries, by the way, and each of them had a community room. I could see that the library as place was very important to the people because a lot of meetings, community meetings, took place in those libraries. I took that into my next book, which was Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library. You can see that perspective in there, people's history, user in the life of the library rather than library in the life of the user. Again, what shouted at me was the how people used these physical places for a variety of social and learning experiences. In addition, I went through the fan mail for the Stratemeyer Syndicate. Stratemeyer Syndicate published Nancy Drew, published the Hardy Boys from the 1930s. Well, they're still publishing, as a matter of fact. And I could see in the fan mail that many of the things that educators were saying could be accomplished only through serious reading were actually being accomplished through leisure reading, but they weren't taking leisure reading seriously. So in this book, Part of Our Lives, it was very obvious to me that there are racial differences, and that led me to this book, Desegregation of Public Libraries in the Jim Crow South, where I discovered, by going from the perspective of the user in the life of the library, a host of Black kids who forcefully integrated Jim Crow public libraries during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, whose existence was hardly known in librarianship. No one had taken the time to look at what they did through their eyes, and they had significant systemic racist structures that they had to attack in order to shift things around. So that led the American Library Association to apologize to those Black teenagers. Many of them are now Black senior citizens, for not doing anything to really assist them in their struggle to integrate libraries, which certainly runs directly contrary to the Library Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1939, but largely ignored as it applied to their lives. So that's what all of that I brought to the book that you showed, Marisol, American Public School Librarianship: A History. The information, the reading, and the place perspectives, but through the eyes of the users, not through the eyes of the managers, the funders, etc. Applying lenses to the history unearthed a number of things. For example, I'll just take let me go through this. I showed you a bunch of books that I've authored. Every one of them has been classified Library of Congress in the Z category, and in the Dewey system, the 027 category. Now ask yourself, as Texas A&M librarians or academic librarians, responsible for selecting titles for your history department or for your education, your College of Education, how likely is it are you to pick up a record of any one of those 4 books in order to consider it for purchase? So what I'm saying is the very classification system that librarians use that helps them identify resources to purchase for their library is a sandbox by itself. If this particular book, American Public School Librarianship: A History, is classified in the 027 section, what's the likelihood that the College of Education bibliographer is going to pick it up? Because it won't be reviewed in many education periodicals. So that's part of that sandbox idea, the very classification system. Also the bibliographic structures that we assemble. Choice magazine, for example. I'm not sure anymore how academic librarians are alerted to new titles in their field. But if the system is not designed to be very broad, but rather refined, a book like American Public School Librarianship: A History might not be noticed by the bibliographer required to acquire materials for that system. I'll go back now to particularly the public school library and show how systemic isms have been built into it. Not many of you are old enough to remember something called the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. Your parents, your grandparents used it in the 20th century. It was very popular, published by the H.W. Wilson Company, started in 1905, and in 1936 it issued an abridged Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, which most high school libraries in the country subscribed to. 1905 it started. No Black periodicals were covered by it. No Spanish periodicals were covered by it. Not until 1955 did Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature pick up Ebony magazine as the sole Black periodical at an index. Okay, so let's say your grandparents went into the library in Sauk Center, Minnesota in 1954, shortly after Brown versus the Board of Education decisions were handed down by the Supreme Court. What information would they find out about Black people by using Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature? None. What they'd find is the white world perspective on African Americans, which was almost always labeled the Negro problem. So you see the systemic isms oozing out of the bibliographic structure that librarianship has created. Another item, Children's Catalog, again, started in 1909 by the H.W. Wilson Company. And for most of the 20th century, the individuals who screened new books in children's literature were white, middle-class, Anglo-Saxon Protestant women who brought their own prejudices and biases with them to the acquisition of materials and the recommendations they made to Children's Catalog. Children's Catalog was issued every 5 years with annual supplements. Libraries across the country, including school libraries, would purchase these. They'd go through their own collections, think of acquiring materials that were in the catalog, and weed materials that weren't in the catalog from their collections. So white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, middle-class women had crafted a series of titles they recommended for all school libraries, all public libraries, that built into some systemic practices. So let me give you an example. You probably all know Little Black Sambo, a book. That made it into children's catalog well into the 1990s. And so as a result, because it was quote unquote recommended by experts, most public and school libraries had it. Yet there was a series of hearings before Congress in the 1960s where Black adults would come in and talk about what happened to them in schools that were integrating. And to a person, they would identify having to sit through a story hour in which the white school librarian would read Little Black Sambo. And their response, all the other kids in the school would start calling that Black kid Sambo, and it was humiliating to them. So you can see the systemic isms built into the bibliographic structure in that way. Let me show you, tell you an exception, however, and then I'll turn this back to Maricel and see if she's got any other questions. In 1957, Black teenager Ollie Neal walked into he skipped his English class and he walked into his high school library and he saw a title there by Frank Yerby. Frank Yerby was a Black writer of Westerns. And because he didn't have permission to take the book out, he stole it. And he took it home and he read it and he got to like it. So he went back and put it back in the place it was before, and he found another Yerby. Now, Yerby, by the way, was not in standard high school catalogs. So the school librarian, who happened to be Black, had specifically picked this title, probably because it was from a Black author. Well, he found another Yerby, and he did the same thing. He stole it. Then he brought it back, and there was a third Yerby. He got to like reading so much so that he improved his grades, and he went off to college. As a matter of fact, he was in college participating in the Memphis Public Library demonstrations that I discuss in this book, and I got to meet Ollie Neal when I gave a lecture at the Memphis Public Library. Well, in the 1970s, he came back for a high school reunion, and the school librarian came up to him and said, you know, that Yerby book that you took out, I knew you stole it. So because I knew you stole it and read it, I went to Memphis to pick up another copy. And then when you stole the second copy and you read it, I went to Memphis a second time to pick up another copy. Well, then you got to reading. Ollie Neal later became the first Black Attorney General of the state of Arkansas and occupied a place on the court. So that shows you that some librarians stepping outside the systemic racism have significantly enabled, through leisure reading, the ability of individuals to negotiate their future quite well. That was just one of the several incidents I found in researching that. So at any rate, that was the framework I took into the book, and it explains my conclusions and findings. So Marisol, you got any questions for me beyond that?
Sure. Related to what you covered about the racial issues in school librarianship, one of the things that you cover in the book is, in the early 20th century, the disproportionate distribution of funds and resources and the biases that came from the materials that were selected. And this was based on, region, class, race, etc. You mentioned states like California in the early 1900s empowering school districts by law to pull their library funds and channel them through California's county library system, which then built a central collection of books and services. And while this is going on in the South, particularly in African-American public school libraries, we see things moving much, much slower. Can you walk us through what's going on in the South around that time in relation to disparities in funding, spaces, and the control or lack thereof of the content of student reading materials?
Sure. One of the things that a historian, I have loved being a historian all of my adult life, because one project leads to another. And you're speaking directly to my current research project, which I've tentatively entitled "In Silence or Indifference, Public School Library Integration in the Jim Crow South, 1954 to 1974. The library, well, for most of the 1950s, excuse me, and the 1960s, particularly in deep South states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, they remained segregated. They had to be dragged to integration, kicking and screaming. And it wasn't until the late 60s and early 70s that the Supreme Court mandated it had to be done, or they weren't going to get any federal funding. They got used to the federal funding, so they made changes. But in the process of being dragged, kicking and screaming, let me give you a hypothetical Black teenager. Let's make her female, in Columbia, South Carolina in 1965. And at the time, the phrase freedom of choice was being used. A black teenager could choose to go into an integrating white high school. If she was one of 10, for example, in a school of 900, well, that's 10 Black teenagers in a school of 900 white teenagers, and you know how teenagers can be with each other. Overlay the racial element in there, and you can imagine what their lives were. Read any book on the 9 students at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, and their lives were just a horror. People would walk on the back of their heels. They would throw spitballs at them. They put thumbtacks on their chairs. They walked into the cafeteria and no one would sit with them. So often there were deliberate attempts not to allow. Well, in the library, this happens sometimes too. And it depended on the librarian, many of whom were racist and favored segregation. So when you walked into the library, it's possible there were no chairs for you, or if you sat down in one chair, the other 5 people who were sitting there would get up and leave. So it was a hostile place in many cases for that integrating Black female student. Let's say she wanted to then do a term paper on the heroes of World War II, one of whom was her father, she believed. Where would she go? The Abridged Reader's Guide. it only indexed Ebony. And of course, Ebony wasn't subscribed to by the white library, which had traditions of purchasing materials from largely white bibliographic guides like Senior High School Library Catalog. Periodicals that, the books also largely purchased from a white-controlled publishing industry favored analyses that were white, and anything that did not support the lost cause or the war between the states perspective generally was not purchased for that white library. So literally the Black teenage female had no reason to go to the library because any information she wanted that was related to race already carried with it systemic racist elements in the literature that was assembled there. In addition, that library probably had a Confederate flag, busts of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, other artifacts that would suggest that the South was a place to be proud, Southern cause in the Civil War was something to be proud of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't a very pleasant place. Now, on the other part, and this really, really surprised me. The American Association of School Librarians, which is a division of the American Library Association, unlike the National Education Association, did absolutely nothing to address the issue of segregated school libraries. They were by nature censorious. I refer back to that Black female teenager wanting to go in and look for information. Well, it wasn't the fact that that titles were removed. It was that they weren't there in the first place. And that Black female teenager may have got, in her Black high school library, may have had access to materials like that, which a Black school librarian would want to do, buy Black authors, have Black newspapers, and et cetera, simply because they recorded what the African-American life was like in those days. So the fact that by nature segregated libraries were censorious, in 1965, the American Association of School Librarians revised a school library Bill of Rights it established in 1954 and still said nothing, absolutely nothing about segregated libraries. There were no workshops on how to integrate public school libraries. There was no research on integrating public school libraries. There were no conference programs at major ALA conferences on. So that's where I get my title for this project, Invisible or Indifferent. So systemic racism was built into the practice of school librarianship in the 1960s.
And this observation that we see about and what we're tackling today, especially in the last 2 years with the social unrest, is this idea that this notion of this sense of uncovering all the systemic and institutional racism that's built within our foundations. Libraries are seen as bastions of neutrality, of democracy, but in itself has a sordid history of keeping people out of these spaces.
That's exactly the reason we must know our history, not the myth and the rhetoric we've built around the practice of librarianship. And there's a lot of myth and rhetoric there that it's not solidly grounded on an understanding of our history, which when we paint portraits, we have to paint not only the halos, we have to paint the warts. Otherwise, we don't understand the full figure.
Absolutely. I want to quickly pivot to censorship and the ties to social justice. And I know we have a couple more minutes before we move into the Q&A, so I'm just going to pivot to this next question. So I knew you had mentioned, public school librarians as censoring certain books. but we're also seeing school librarians as opponents of censorship and defender of intellectual freedom. Could you speak about the historical perspective that you bring up in your book and what we can learn from those moments in history to inform what we're observing today?
What I'd like to do, Marisol, is just read from a 2-page op-ed I wrote in the last couple of days. Would that be okay?
Yes.
In 1958, shortly after the Alabama Public Library Service Division acquired copies of a popular children's book titled The Rabbit's Wedding for statewide distribution through its bookmobiles, state lawmaker E.O. Edens loudly objected. One of the rabbits depicted on the cover was black and the other white, Edens observed. To him, that was a sure sign the book advocated interracial marriage. This book and many others, he argued, should be taken off the shelves and burned. In 1961, the Atlanta Constitution reported that a Georgia County school superintendent removed 4 books from school libraries, not because they were subversive, but because they were objectionable. Titles included Richard Wright's Black Boy, Story of a Black Boy Growing Up in Mississippi, and Oliver Lafarge's 1930 Pulitzer Prize winning Laughing Boy about a Navajo couple's conflicts with the white establishment. Superintendent wanted to know how those books got there in the first place, since they were on no approved list. In 1985, school officials in Racine, Wisconsin routinely rejected the titles like Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, William Blatty's The Exorcist, and Judy Blume's Forever. The Wisconsin Library Association censored the district for these censorious practices, but to no effect. It was much ado about nothing, the superintendent said, as he continued rejecting titles to which he and other school officials objected. Now comes Texas lawmaker Matt Krause, who has demanded that the state school district libraries identify whether they own 850 specific books, many of which address the issues of race and sexuality. Among them are Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and Rob Sanders' Pride, the Story of Harvey Milk and the Rainbow Flag. Krause's initiative fits a pattern of current attacks on critical race theory, in which opponents argue that school systems and their libraries across the country are trying to indoctrinate children. As a library historian, I can only say, here we go again. These kinds of efforts are a common thread through the history of American public and public school libraries. They are not sparked by desires to prevent indoctrination, but instead to perpetuate it by carefully controlling the information materials to which children are exposed in public schools and libraries. Unfortunately, however, members of the nation's public and school library communities are poorly equipped to combat these censorious efforts. Although the American Library Association can attack them as violations of the Library Bill of Rights and Freedom to Read statements, transgressions carry about as many consequences as Racine school officials suffered when censured by the Wisconsin Library Association in 1985. Librarians on the firing line will get some help from guidelines addressing efforts to remove books that were previously approved by public library and school boards. But at this very moment, many local public and school librarians across the nation are weighing whether or not they will challenge the censors. A few are closeted LGBTQ people working in homophobic environments. Some are single mothers with dependent children. Others are actually sympathetic to the ideas peddled by the current crop of censors. If history is any teacher, the most effective way to combat people like Krause comes from citizens who object at the local level. For example, at a 1995 Claremont County, Ohio public library meeting attended by 150 people to discuss The Advocate, a gay periodical that drew a petition signed by 4,000 citizens wanting it banned, Andrea Blankenmeyer walked slowly to the podium. Knowing all eyes were upon her, she choked with emotion. I'm 19 years old and I'm gay. I only wish I had access to a magazine like The Advocate when I was younger. It would have made my life a lot easier. Ultimately, the library decided to leave The Advocate on the open shelf. History shows resistance to censorship is most effective when it's locally generated. We need more citizens like Andrea Blankenmeyer who are willing to take on the censors like Matt Krause and his ilk. Okay, I'm done now.
And looking at this through a social justice lens, two of the four principles that operate under this framework are access to resources and participation. It seems that by removing books and other resources with varying perspectives based on the supposition that they cause, quote, harm or distress to children, brings up unnecessary barriers and it reduces the voices and options of those seeking empowerment through the stories that they can relate to.
Right.
And something that's been on my mind, especially with the current efforts to censor books, is a statement that George M. Johnson, the author of All Boys Aren't Blue, told The Advocate earlier this month in response to parents and school boards attempting to ban their book from libraries and school libraries. And that is, quote, denying kids sex education, denying kids understanding around consent, understanding around topics of racism, topics of gender, and topics of identity. It does nothing to help the child because the child still has to exist in a world where all of those things exist. My one book is not what is going to harm your child. It is the fact that you are not allowing them to understand the world that they live in that is ultimately going to harm your child. So that sits with me with everything that's, attempts to ban predominantly books written by Black, Indigenous people of color, members of the LGBT or authors of the LGBTQ plus community. It has a negative repercussions for people that are seeking these out. So I got on my
No, it's all right.
here. Yeah, so I know we're at about the period where we move into the Q&A. So I do want to give some space for people to ask questions. Again, please send them directly to Jeremy, and I'll kind of turn it over to him to direct the Q&A portion. Jeremy?
Thanks, Marisol. Yeah, so questions can be sent in the chat, or if you just come up with one on the fly, you can use a little raise your hand icon that's, should be at the bottom of your screen. I actually have I have a question, because this particular area of library history is not very well known to me. So I'm kind of curious, Dr. Wiegand, you talked about how these some of these Jim Crow era libraries were kind of desegregated at the local level, by local protesters. I'm wondering, why did, now I'm reasonably educated, so I've heard about, we know about the bus boycotts, and we know in Montgomery, and we know about the desegregation of lunch counters in places like Greensboro, but I'm wondering why the history of libraries being desegregated isn't kind of more well known as part of the overall civil rights movement history.
Well, there are a bunch of reasons for it. I'll mention a couple. Once the Montgomery bus boycotts hit and Martin Luther King spoke to the media, he was sort of assumed to be the spokesperson for the entire movement, and the media tended to follow him around. Seldom was he involved in any kind of public library protest. Almost all of the public library protests were generated by kids who had been inspired by the Greensboro Woolworth lunch counter activities. So they were looking for institutions that would not admit them, public institutions, and a number of them attacked libraries. I shouldn't say, they walked into libraries. I'll focus particularly on, as an example, on the Tougaloo Nine. Tougaloo College is a couple of miles outside Jackson, Mississippi. And the Tougaloo College had an NAACP youth chapter that Medgar Evers visited. And together they decided, we're going to protest at the Jackson Public Library. And so they organized themselves. 9 of them agreed to go. They were all sort of screened for how they would behave if threatened. And then they walked in, and the media were alerted before that time. And so there was a camera there. I don't think they ever aired the segment. I found the segment in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And it just made me so excited because there they were, the actual. Now, one of the Tougaloo Nine, 9, she and I have sort of taken to doing a song and dance routine. We go from place to place, and I give the story of the protest, and she talks about how she was organized in it. Now, why don't you know about that? Well, I'd ask you, Jeremy, did you have a library history course in library school?
That is a very good question. I, in fact, did not. So, yeah.
Because accredited schools of information do not focus on history. They regard it as something less desirable than data mining. The next thing is, it's an unpleasant subject for librarians to talk about. So there's your portraits with halos and warts. I'm a guy who looks at history, hopefully through as holistic set of eyes as I can find, and I'm looking for the warts. It's not that I'm deliberately looking for the warts, but I sure as hell am not going to look away from them either. So the warts came out, and that's it. I published the book, and well, let me go back to the warts issue. In 1996, I published The Irrepressible Reformer, a biography of Melville Dewey. It was the 4th biography of Dewey published in the 20th century. But my biography pointed out that he was an anti-Semite, a sexual harasser, and a racial bigot, because I got into his personal life, not just his professional life. When the book was reviewed, a number of reviewers criticized me for looking for all the bad things about Dewey. And it wasn't until 2016 that a writer for American Libraries decided, you know, maybe Dewey shouldn't be named after one of our most prestigious awards. And she brought this to the attention of the American Library Association Council, and they focused on it. Well, by that time, there were Dewey podcasts, there were Dewey this, Dewey that. The programmed worship of Melville Dewey was there in place, so it made it kind of difficult for the American Library Association to look at this icon's real character. And so 20 years after the book was published, the American Library Association decided to change its name of the Melville Dewey Award. That for me is an indicator of the profession's reluctance to look at its history rather than look at its history in a non-celebratory way.
And so following up on that, just would you, not to hog all the questions, but would you say we're starting to see kind of, as you have a new, I can't talk today. You start to get younger librarians moving up in the profession who have been raised in a new era. You start to see more breaks in that kind of hero worship sort of librarianship.
I can't say it's about for libraries, for the students who are coming up through the programs. Most of them, the vast majority of them, are graduating into professional positions with a very poor knowledge of the profession's own history. And so they have a platform from which to act. I can very easily explain some of the things that BIPOC people are now recognizing. I can give them history because I've been looking for it. But for them, it's like discovery. It shouldn't be discovery. We should know the flaws in our history because it helps us better approach the present and thus better plan for the future.
That was very helpful. Yes, you're real. I have a lot of gaps in my library history education, certainly. So let me just, are there any other questions before we can, I mean, Marisol here has others, and I have others we can ask too, but I want to spread the array of voices. Well, let me ask another quick question that again reflects my ahistorical knowledge here. So, I mean, librarianship is still very mainly, obviously, a white profession, and we see it everywhere. When did we start to see librarians of color kind of getting into the profession in any sort of appreciable numbers? I know it's still a small trickle when you compare to the overall number, but I mean, it seems to be a growing number.
Yeah, well, the librarianship began to recognize that much of the 20th century, when you talked about African Americans, from a white perspective, it was always a Negro problem. That's how whites described issues of race. Well, it really wasn't. It was a white problem because they were the ones that were being bigoted. That also extended into the profession. When the civil rights movement of the 1960s occurred, certain legislation was passed. And if you wanted federal funds, you had to abide by certain requirements. That opened up things for Black people who wanted to become librarians. So their numbers increased then. I'll go back to the school library, for example. The elementary and education secondary, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act passed in 1965. Within 10 years, quadrupled the average size of the school library, doubled the numbers of libraries, many of which were established in neighborhoods, in Black neighborhoods. So they wanted Black librarians. So there was a demand for them. And so many Black young people responded to that demand. Generally, however, it was Black librarians in Black neighborhoods. You didn't see many Black librarians in white neighborhoods. You saw a number of white librarians in Black neighborhoods, however, but the profession has become friendlier to Black people than it was certainly in the early part of the 20th century. So because it's friendlier, I think more people came to join the profession. The practicing library profession rates extremely highly on satisfactory professions. It's always done so. So Black Americans who work in libraries experience the same kind of pleasure at the same rate as white Americans do.
Okay, that's interesting. I appreciate that. So for the last few minutes, let me kick it back to Marisol, who is our actual host and MC. So Marisol, I'm going to go back to you for final questions or final words. So.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that if there are any questions, feel free to unmute for these last few minutes. But if we're okay, I'm going to pose one more question for you, Dr. Wiegand, before we conclude today's lecture. And that is, as stated earlier, your book is the first comprehensive evaluative history of the American public school library. It historically examines the perspective of library as the, quote, heart of the school. It identifies the public school library's historical jurisdictions and opportunities. It analyzes the politics of female-dominated school library profession, and so much more that I know we couldn't get to. But are there any final takeaways from this book that you would like to impart to the audience?
Well, let me pose this to the audience. Let's see how it's received, because it does cover some rather unpleasant things. Will the library profession or the school library profession tend not to see it, not to look at it, not to engage intellectually with the ideas that I posit there? Let's see how it's received.
It's fair enough. All right, so I know just in trying to keep time, be respectful of everyone's time, I just want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and also sending Dr. Wiegand a virtual round of applause for joining us this afternoon to discuss his recent book. If you'd like a copy of American Public School Librarianship, A History, please visit your local or online bookstore. All royalties for this book will be donated to the Dr. Jean E. Lowry Global Lecture Endowment, which helps fund the International Association of School Librarians annual Jean E. Lowry Lecture and the Florida Book Awards annual Jean E. Lowry Older Children's Literature Award Endowment. Or you can also visit our library catalog to check out the ebook. So just to move on to what is coming up in the spring semester, we'll be having our next lecture of the series, Pedagogy at the Podium, Social Justice in or Lacking in Library Education. We'll be joined by library and information science professors to discuss the relationship between social justice and librarianship in today's generation of library students. This event is scheduled on Tuesday, February 22nd at 1 p.m. Central Time, and I'm just going to pop the link to the registration page in the chat. Also, in about an hour, you'll receive a survey in your inbox. Please, we'd be incredibly grateful if you could fill out this anonymous survey. Your feedback helps us create a better experience for you and others. And finally, a recording of this event will be uploaded to the library's YouTube page within 48 hours, and we'll share it with you when it becomes available. And that pretty much closes my remarks. So again, I want to thank you, Dr. Wiegand, for joining us this afternoon and sharing about the research that you put into this book and exposing the warts in our history, but also giving that resource to explore our history. So thank you, Dr. Wiegand, and thank you all for joining us.